My name's David Sandalow. I'm at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, and we're here in Abu Dhabi almost at the end of 2 days of really remarkable programming here at the Global Energy Forum, run by Atlantic Council. And just reflecting back on it, we've had 2 days of speakers from around the world talking about topics on every continent, really having to do with everything in the energy system. And in this session, we're going to talk about this region. We're going to talk about MENA, Middle East and North Africa, and the energy transition in this region. And of course, the MENA region is rich in conventional energy resources, but is also extremely rich in new energy resources. And we're going to talk about that and the challenges and opportunities related to that. Couldn't have four better panelists, deep expertise in these topics to talk about it. And I'm going to ask each one of them to introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll get a conversation going. And we'll start with my friend and colleague, Robin. We work together. Robin has other jobs, which I'll tell you about, but he's also a colleague of mine at Columbia University. So, Robin.
Thank you, David. Thanks, everybody, today. So I'm Robin Mills, and I run Qamar Energy, which is an energy consultancy based in Dubai, just pretty near to us here, of course, and consulting on energy strategy, commercial and business development across the MENA region. And at least half of our work these days is concerned with the energy transition in all of its forms, whether renewables, hydrogen, carbon capture, efficiency, batteries, and everything else. And indeed, as David said, also a colleague of his at the Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy, where we're also very global and we deal with energy transition all around the world, whether in MENA or North America or any other part of the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. Olivia.
Thanks. My name's Olivia. I work for an organization called the Clean Air Task Force. We're an environmental organization whose mission is to decarbonize the global energy system. We do this through pushing optionality, so we need more options, not fewer. And how can we unblock these technologies and these strategies to decarbonize the energy system from a policy and business level? What is needed from public and private actors to make these strategies and technologies commercial?
Thanks, Olivia. Marco.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Margheri. I'm serving as the head of U.S. Relations for ENI and the president of the Italian section of the World Energy Council, which coordinates at the present time an action to bring together Mediterranean committees. ENI is an Italian energy company. I think there are two characteristics of what we do that are relevant to our discussion. First, we operate in 68 countries throughout the world, but our main focus is on Africa and the Middle East. 50% of what we do is done here. And the second is that ENI has been amongst the most advanced company in adopting decarbonization strategies with a -35 2030, -80 2040, and net zero in 2050 on scopes 1, 2, and 3. So we also deal with helping demand evolving towards decarbonization.
Great. And Jennifer.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jennifer Sara. I'm the Global Director for Climate Change at the World Bank. The World Bank is, most of you know, the largest multilateral financier of climate action. We've financed $31.7 billion last year. My job is really to coordinate all the activities that we do on climate change. Also, I'm in the public sector side, but also with the private arm. You were asking about that, IFC and MEGA, so that we come with a one World Bank group value proposition on the climate and development agenda.
Thanks. Well, actually, I see a fair amount of pretty deep expertise in the room on this topic, but we don't want to assume expertise from anyone in the audience, either watching online later or in the crowd now. And so let's just start with talking about what's happening today with the energy transition in the region. And then what do you see as the opportunities? So let me just start with you on that, Robin. Just for those who may not be familiar with this, what's happening in this space?
So I moved to the UAE in 2006, and that was also the year that Masdar was founded as a clean energy vehicle for Abu Dhabi. And I think that was a very important signal of the way the region was going. You know, this was a stage when, which, let's say, environmental and climate awareness was at a very early stage, and the progress in the 16, 17 years since then has been enormous. But I would say in the MENA region, also quite patchy, right? So you have some countries that are clearly very committed to the energy transition and are doing a lot, others which have maybe other issues that are more pressing to them right now. Other thing about the region, of course, it's a very important exporter of oil and gas, as we well know. But again, not every country in the region is an exporter of oil and gas. Some are importers, and some have to deal with the challenges of often being relatively low-income importers of energy and all the challenges that come with that. So that means that the energy transition across the region is quite patchy, and what we see, I think, is that there are some leaders in the region, and then there are other countries which are seeing what's happening and maybe trying to emulate this and trying to move on themselves in their own ways. And I think, if you pick out obvious leaders, the country that we're in right now, the UAE, is one of those. It has the world's largest single-site solar power project. It has the world's largest solar farm. It has the world's first commercial carbon capture and storage project on an industrial facility. It has a very large civil nuclear program, which is just coming up to full capacity. A very active program of energy subsidy reform and pricing reforms to drive energy efficiency, and a whole host of other initiatives which will come up over the next few years. I suppose just down the road from us here, we have the International Renewable Energy Agency conference, which is running concurrently with this one, and IRENA is headquartered in Abu Dhabi. And of course, the UAE is hosting COP28 later this year. So, a country that's very active in climate diplomacy and international organisations and so on, as well as the tangible projects on the ground. And also a very active international investor in renewables. Masdar, which I mentioned at the start, now an active investor in large wind farms and solar farms in the UK, for example, very actively throughout parts of Africa, Central Asia, and elsewhere in the world. Then I think I pick out right at the other end of MENA, you've got Morocco, a country which isn't an oil and gas producer of any significance, but which does have great solar and wind resources, is right next to Europe. And so Morocco is very active in trying to develop renewable energy and thinking about exports of renewable power and hydrogen to Europe. So really kind of a contrasting model, but also a success story. And then in the middle of those, I would point to another country, which is Egypt. Again, a lower income country, one with excellent solar and wind resources, also quite a lot of hydrocarbons, although on the whole a net importer. But a country that's very pivotal because of its geography, obviously sitting at the eastern Mediterranean, the Suez Canal and so on, and a country that is potentially a bridge between the North Africa and the Middle East part of MENA, and between MENA and the Mediterranean world and Europe. So that's a country which has taken longer to come to the energy transition, but which is now also coming up very, very quickly. A lot of major projects hosted COP27 last year, of course, as well. And then, you have other countries in the region which are lower income, which are suffering conflict, where just keeping the energy industry alive is a big enough challenge, and it's very hard for them to think strategically about the energy transition and trying to move it forward. And it's a big challenge to think, how do we bring the lessons from some of the leaders into these other countries in MENA?
Robin, thank you for that tremendous overview. Olivia, do you want to talk some about the opportunities? How does this grow from here, from the baseline that Robin just told us about? How do you see this growing? And then maybe turn to Jennifer to talk about your view on the needs of and what the population needs.
Yeah, thank you. So I think what's really important is that we have an inclusive conversation and that all nations and all regions are able to bring to the conversation what an energy transition and what climate looks like for them. So for actors in this region, we have a lot of the largest producers of today's energy, and we're seeing some positive signals for what potential future energy that is decarbonized can look like. So building off some of the things that Robin mentioned, we're seeing movements of carbon capture and storage, which by most accounts is going to account for quite a large abatement of emissions within this region. And Saudi Arabia has now announced that it will be looking to scale up one of the largest carbon capture and storage facilities in the world by 2027. And by 2035, we'll be looking to capture about 11 million tons of CO2. So this is important signals and important demonstrations that for an oil-producing country, carbon capture and storage is going to be a big part of their energy transition roadmap. We're also seeing, similar in the UAE, announcements around the scale-up of carbon capture and storage. And the COP27, it was a unique opportunity. It was the first time that we saw the industry be brought to the conversation and have all actors included, which is going to be so important if we're going to be realistic about how do we tackle climate and how do we move the energy system to one that is kinder to the climate. So there's short-term measures that we need to be looking at, and some of the lowest hanging fruit. So methane is a low-hanging fruit that we can all look towards, and we're seeing good momentum around that now with the Global Methane Pledge. And a number of actors in this region have signed on, but then the next step is how do we go about implementing that? And then looking towards the medium and long term, how do we stand up new industries like carbon capture and storage industry and taking it from this project level up to scale so that it can be meaningful in terms of climate impact. But in order to do that, we're going to need to see a lot of partnerships. We're going to have to come up with creative ways of financing and also having actors club together to abate emissions and the co-locating of emissions, different policy mechanisms, crowding in finance. So I think what we've seen now is a lot of positive momentum and a level setting of the fact that all these actors need to be at the table in order to rise to this challenge. But now the next step is, now that we're all on the same page, what's the next step in that? How do we crowd in the financing? What are the policies? What are the gaps so that we can take the demonstration to wide-scale application?
Let's come back to how we do that, but let me turn to you, Jennifer, and kind of your thoughts from the World Bank on these topics.
Thanks. I mean, I think, first of all, let's take a step back and globally, World Bank is a global institution. I think it's important that we recognize that all countries need to act on climate, and developed countries really need to do their part too to accelerate action, giving the greater responsibility for the historical emissions, and also the availability of knowledge and larger resources. In MENA, for countries in MENA, in the spirit also of this being an inclusive, the next COP being an inclusive COP, I think it's important to think also the stakes are very, very high. The greenhouse gas footprint in the region is small compared to other regions. It's 8.7% of global emissions. But it's also the most climate vulnerable region in the world. Parts of Algeria, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq will face extreme temperature rise. Coastal areas, especially on the Mediterranean, will see less rainfall. So the impacts are huge, and they're also very much linked to threat multipliers, what we call them, in the countries. They compromise water security, land use, they impact food prices, and we see all the linkages, and importantly, the socio-political instability. So within that, in the region, we're also seeing that climate impacts could also drive significant climate migration. 9% of the region's population, or about 19 million people, could be forced to move within their own countries. But we also see a huge opportunity. I think that's what we're trying to get into on the flip side, where we see that climate action also offers huge promising opportunities for the region. Renewables, we've been talking a lot about renewables. MENA receives about a quarter of all solar energy striking the earth, and the solar energy potential in the region can meet at least 50% of global energy demand. Wind speeds in countries like Morocco, Egypt, and Tunisia are among the highest in the world. And we also see, really importantly, that low carbon energy transition is really important to boost economic growth. It diversifies industries, creates jobs, brings a new value change. So that's part of the framing. And what we really see in the region, the opportunity, is the leadership in the countries. And we see, for example, that the UAE has set a net zero commitment by 2050. Morocco aims to have 80% of its total electricity generation capacity from renewables by 2050. The region has also had 3 record-breaking low-cost auctions for solar energy in UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. And these are great examples for the region, but also for the world. But the last point I think is important, and I think you'll speak more of that, is that if we want to unlock the benefits of the low-carbon transition, it will require policy shifts and long-term planning. And that came up several times, I think yesterday too. The Bank of America really stressed the importance of long-term planning if you're going to be able to crowd in finance. And what we see in the MENA region is really the lack of an integrated regional energy systems and market. And as a result, only 2% of the electricity produced in the region is actually traded between the countries each year. So it's tiny. So at the bank, what we're doing is supporting efforts by our countries to develop a pan-Arab electricity market, which could increase cross-border electricity trade from 2% currently to 40% by 2035. And these are important. The policy shifts and long-term plannings really are part of also this economic diversification I was talking about. So overall, I think it's huge opportunity, but also let's remember the human face of the climate and the need for adaptation as well.
Thank you. Marco, we were having an interesting conversation before the session about the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on the pace of the transition here. You want to share your thoughts on that? I thought it's quite interesting.
Yeah, sure. Well, I will start from the last word of Jennifer, the human aspect of it.
Okay.
And in the region, let's just consider how many tens of millions of people have been added to the population in Egypt over the past decade. Let us just consider that an entire new Egypt will be added to North Africa in the coming decades. So the continuing challenge of that part of the region has been to power human development, has been to power economic growth in such a way that it wouldn't be detrimental or disruptive to the climate objectives, and ultimately to the environmental objectives that, for the reasons that Jennifer has already mentioned in the Mediterranean, for example, are particularly relevant. Now, clearly, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has created an environment in which the relevance of the region, because of the wealth of resources that exist here, has become pivotal in the short run for one of the major energy markets in the world, which is the northern rim of the Mediterranean and the European Union in particular. Let me just remind ourselves that only 20–25% of cargoes coming out of Egypt would flow to Europe. Lately it was 70%. Or let me just remind ourselves that my own country, Italy, could move as quick as replacing 50% of the Russian volumes, and they were very substantial for the country. We're speaking up to 30% of the gas we were consuming. So it was -50 in the first winter. It will be -80 in the coming winter. It will be -100%. We will eliminate Russian supplies in 3 years' time, and Algeria played a fundamental role in triggering this development. So clearly the first opportunity is how we create an environment in which peer-to-peer trade, an increased level of cooperation between countries. Let me quote the Eastern Mediterranean Gas Forum that has been very important to trigger cooperation in a particular area of the world where it would be the first gas province where no country can really monetize their resources without cooperating with other countries, either for transporting the molecule or for reaching final markets. All these aspects and an increased role of this region, of the Middle East, of the Gulf, in the relations within the region and with the European Union. All of these are opportunities that can be triggered if we deliver a better policy cooperation, if there is more attention to the region in Brussels and in national capitals, and if there is a more solid pragmatism, a more inclusive pragmatism, and I remember the words of His Excellency Sultan Al-Jaber yesterday on how he sees COP28 driving this conversation. Well, if we go into that direction, clearly the inclusive COP28 can really become the platform for seizing these opportunities. And let me finish on another aspect. Today, there were a number of conversations here on critical minerals. And there were a number of conversations on how different areas of the world, emerging economies, need to be factored in a technology map for the transition that is way more articulate and diverse than the one we expected it to be before the Russian invasion, that has been ultimately a very rapid call to action. So now we know that we can not only focus on electrons, and this is critical for a region that lives and drives and ships things on molecules, and that we can not only focus on an imaginary world in which there is policy planning done somewhere in one country and then deployed to the rest of the world. There needs to be regional approaches on technologies such as CCUS, biofuels. There needs to be regional participation in the global climate debate because this region has very specific demand needs that need to be addressed in the model for the transition. And there again is a big opportunity for COP28 to drive this conversation around the world.
Robin, you live in the region, one of the world's leading experts on the topic we're talking about. Any further thoughts on the opportunities in the region that you want to elaborate on in the clean energy transition?
Well, I think my fellow panelists made some really important points on trade and integration within the region, on trade in gas, trade in electricity, trade perhaps in hydrogen, and indeed there is a huge opportunity there, and also many barriers and political barriers, institutional barriers, and so on. Why there isn't more trade, even in gas, which is traded very successfully elsewhere in the world. One thing I would point out, which I think is an emerging opportunity which arises from several factors, is the industrialization opportunity. I mean, this is a region which, outside a few kind of energy-based industries, is not heavily industrialized. And that has always been a drag on economic growth and employment and so on, and particularly in the less energy-rich countries in the region. You've got a number of factors that maybe can change that. So the whole decarbonisation agenda, the search for low-cost but also low-carbon energy, the need to replace industry and energy-intensive products and so on that previously came from Russia or from Russian, the use of Russian energy, and the move in the West to kind of try and decouple from Chinese industry and develop more supply chains from friendly countries. I think all of those create a great opportunity for the MENA region, which obviously is in great proximity to Europe and also to some other important consuming areas like India. This region has obviously low-cost oil, low-cost gas, very abundant. It has excellent CO2 storage resources for doing decarbonised but fossil fuel-based projects. And it has great solar resources and in some places great wind resources as well. So if you put all that together, you have a place which could really be a centre of low-carbon industry, creating low-carbon materials like aluminium, which it already does to an extent, steel, various chemicals, ammonia, methanol, all this kind of stuff, but then going up the value chain and generating more value and more sophistication from these. And we see that kind of strategy maybe starting to emerge. I think the interest in green and blue hydrogen then leads to thought of, and we see this in Egypt, for example, leads to thought of, okay, we're doing a green hydrogen project. Well, we're going to export a lot of it, but we can use some locally. We have a fertilizer plant, why not switch it over to green hydrogen? And then all the other opportunities that can come from that. So I think that's a very major and very tangible opportunity, and also kind of future-proofing. We see this, for example, in Saudi Arabia right now, developing electric vehicle manufacturing, trying to develop parts of the battery supply chain. That is an opportunity to, say, develop new industries that are, as we go into a decarbonising world, maybe we have more electric vehicles, less oil demand, but okay, if this region can grow other industries that will fit in that new decarbonised world. I think, again, some countries in this region clearly see that, are trying to build it in their different ways. But I see this as an area where the region could do more collectively. I mean, not every country has to try and do the whole supply chain itself. I mean, integrated supply chains will be more effective and more economic. Pooling domestic markets, and many countries have a pretty small domestic market, not really enough to support a full supply chain, but if you have a wider common market, that creates more opportunities. And then working more actively with Europe in particular as a neighbouring partner in terms of developing these supply chains with a friendly neighbour. And Europe has quite a lot of incentives to do that as well. Let's see more economic growth along the southern coast of the Mediterranean, which hopefully improves political stability and so on in terms of the relationship with Europe as well.
Olivia, I wanted to ask about two technologies. One you mentioned previously, which is CCS, and kind of what do you see as the main barriers to CCS, and what is it going to take for CCS to really scale up in this region and be an enabler of blue hydrogen and more? And then nuclear, which has been briefly mentioned, but what's happening with nuclear in the region, and how do you see that growing?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to pick up on a few things that some of my panelists mentioned as well. And how, because of this region has its own unique resources, it's very different to other nations such as Europe who are setting their climate agenda, the toolkit of what we will need in this region is going to look different to other parts of the world. So I think it's really important that we have that more inclusive conversation and recognize things like water scarcity issues. So the region will be looking at both the blue and the green hydrogen. And that these drawing of lines is about which hydrogen is better. The focus really needs to be more on what's the greenhouse gas content of that hydrogen, and unblocking that at a policy level so that investment can flow and we can begin to see the scale of hydrogen that's required. So the IEA, for example, is projecting a 5-fold increase from hydrogen from today's levels. In terms of CCS, we already have hydrogen within the MENA region, so a low-hanging fruit would be to use CCS to clean up that existing hydrogen. And then what's the role of both hydrogen in bringing that to scale? Again, with nuclear, we could also look at nuclear hydrogen. Is that a possibility? But again, it's looking at what is the greenhouse gas potential, the greenhouse gas benefits of that hydrogen. And I think the recent energy shocks have also shown the other need that we need to have more options on the table, not fewer. To have a concentrated strategy is a very risky strategy, and no one knows how this energy transition ultimately is going to go, both from an economic standpoint. Technically, we don't know what barriers we'll run into. Water scarcity was mentioned. So by having more options on the table, it buffers us against that risk as we build in this transition. And then as far as carbon capture and storage, we're seeing great momentum. But in order to take that to the next level, this region is an exporter, so much is reliant on signals coming from the regions and the nations that they're producing these products for. So the next step on that really is what are the policy barriers and what are the gaps, and what are the customers demanding, and what's going to bridge the additional cost, that commercial gap. And how can we work together to come up with these new agreements that will unlock more investment and see more project activity?
Thank you. Marco, could you talk about what ENI is doing in the region and kind of how ENI sees its role in the energy transition here?
Well, happily. The first thing that I believe is now very obvious is that we have to power the regional development here as much as for neighboring economies. And ENI has been founded with this idea of a dual flag. That is, where we operate, we hardly realize a project just for bringing energy somewhere else. Where we operate, we tend to be a contributor to the local development of energy systems. And I think the region has offered one of the most prominent examples of this with the discovery of Zohr, which has changed Egypt's energy balance in the course of the past years. So I think there, the first aspect, going back to your previous questions of the opportunities, is how we bridge these capabilities. I'm thinking to the new discoveries that will be triggered soon in Cyprus. I'm thinking to the new wave of discoveries that we're seeing in Egypt itself. How do we trigger this into solid, stable, cooperative regional development? Number one. And number two, how do we ensure, and here I'm thinking to the incredible partnership that we can have with interlocutors like ADNOC in Abu Dhabi, how do you turn legacy energy developments in the most sustainable legacy energy developments possible? So how do you allow for a role of gas that relies more and more on LNG, that becomes more agile, flexible, future-proof? How do you allow for technologies that reduce the carbon footprint, scopes 1 and 2, of your present energy production and transport? And there I see an incredible role for overcoming the past year's conversation with many institutions and institutional actors on identifying sustainable finance as something that would divide a black and white list of people who do right stuff and people who do wrong stuff. Things that have a positive impact on the emission reduction speed are to be fostered throughout the chain. And in this region, this will be particularly relevant because you have the competences, you have extraordinary competences in the upstream sector. You have financial resources, and you have an incredible commitment, often underrepresented in capitals in Europe and in DC, to turn these economies around and really foster, for example, the UAE as an incredible innovation hub. So this is the first thing we want to be doing. Second thing we want to be doing is continuing to invest on the renewables that we know. On solar, where we are investing throughout the region in all of the countries of presence. And this, there is a few projects that we're doing in Algeria, a few projects that we're doing in Egypt. But let me remind us that a very significant achievement in Egypt was the idea of solar investments that could power local development and allow for hydrocarbons to be efficiently packaged into an innovative model for reaching global markets. Let us remind ourselves that Algeria had a spectacular growth over the last 3 decades in energy access. This is not a region that lacks energy access as, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, but we need to make sure that this goes with the right technologies to continue being powered. Very last point, again, this is a region in which we need to focus across the board of decarbonizing different energy vectors. We cannot imagine this region to live out of electrons alone. If we sit in Stockholm, sustainable mobility has one perspective. If we sit in Cairo, it has a different one. And if we sit in a remote area of Morocco, that has a third meaning again. And we need to foster decarbonized solutions for all of these environments. And let me quote what ENI is doing. We're investing across the board of research and development to develop new innovative biofeedstock for biorefineries. We have done testing in Tunisia in the region. We have started an agri-hub project in Kenya that has delivered the first cargo of biofuels for our biorefineries in Sicily, which are projected into the Mediterranean. So we believe that this is really a frontier for the future, and the region should definitely not be left without these opportunities.
There's so much to talk about. I want to talk about wind, I want to talk about solar, I want to talk more about finance. So it's COP28, but Olivia mentioned water, and I know you've got very deep experience, Jennifer, on water, and obviously it's one of those driest regions in the world. And so how does that affect the energy transition here? Any thoughts on that?
No, great. I thought you were going to talk about finance. Water's always, we'd start with water, we'll come back to finance later. But we all know energy is a really thirsty business. That's what we say. It doesn't even, it's thermal energy, it's renewable energy, it's incredibly thirsty. And a lot of times the water footprint is not always looked upon. At the same time, we have to remember that the water sector is very, very highly energy dependent. So I think, and then when you look at the region MENA, I mean, this is really a region that is very interesting. It's very energy rich and very water poor. And that you have the mix of the two. And I think whenever you talk about what the strategy would be for this region is to take into account. As you think about the energy systems transition, the water energy nexus has to be at the core of what you're thinking about. I mean, 6 out of every 10 people in the region live in highly or extremely water-stressed areas. I mean, that's more than half of it today, without knowing the projections for the future. These areas where we have high water scarcity accounts for 70% of the region's GDP. The region's getting hotter, it's getting drier, and the studies that we've done shows that the resulting water scarcity could reduce GDP by 6 to 14% annually, by 2050 in a 4-degree world. But we're not going to get to a 4-degree world. But there's just, I mean, the doomsday projections are important to bear in mind how they really do impact the water cycle and the freshwater availability in the region. The region has been very, very good in meeting the water scarcity challenge by diversifying supplies. And many of the supplies are actually, as I mentioned, very energy intensive if you get into reverse osmosis, very much focused on supply solutions. We think it's important to look at the demand side management as well. So where are the huge efficiency gains that we can have what are the right tariffs and what's the right policy environment. So I think balancing that out is very, very important as the region addresses the energy transition, the water transition, to also look at both supply and demand together as a package of how we're going to address the challenge. Desalinated water is going to be very important. Everyone's talking about green hydrogen. And as we were saying before this, green hydrogen requires a lot of fresh water. And so if you need to desalinate water to create fresh water to then produce the green hydrogen, it's thinking through that whole equation, the brine, and even if it's all renewable energy, it's really important to factor in the water footprint. Now, I was going to mention, I'll come back to that later, that we've starting to produce these country climate and development reports where we're drilling down in specific countries. How do we support countries reach their development targets, their SDGs, with their climate transition targets, their NDCs and long-term strategies if they have them. And in Jordan, for example, we were able to drill down that there's a huge cost savings in energy costs if there's good energy efficiency measures in the water sector. So that linkage is very, very important, and very much in agriculture. So we can see a 20% reduction in water usage in the agriculture sector creates a huge, not just a drop in how much water they're going to consume, but how much energy is being consumed. So I think that those are the types of studies that we really need to think about. And then, again, the water is going to be very important to the whole adaptation agenda, the loss and damage. We're thinking about water scarcity, and ironically, in the region too, they can get hit by floods. And so that's also part of the water management equation. So let me stop there because I can go on and on water.
That was fascinating. I just want to see if any of the other panelists have any thoughts on the water piece of this they would like to add. And then we'll go to finance. Marco, please.
Can I not respond to your question, but
okay.
build on one thing that Jennifer has said? I think water is a paramount example of the nexus that you need to build amongst policies. You cannot isolate one component of the energy system and hope to work just on that. And in what she said, I see two examples that I think are fitting. The first aspect is how you use soil, space in this region. This is a region that oftentimes has very densely populated areas where demand is highly concentrated, and areas where you may have the resources, but distant from demand. So how do you deal with a different distribution of renewable technologies, of renewable facilities and ways of production in a region that has very specific characteristics? And I think this is something where, for example, policy and international financial institutions can help designing plans that allow for long-term planning. We go back to that. A second example that was triggered from your example on energy efficiency and Jordan. Clearly, if you see, let's say, if you accelerate a decarbonization strategy that enhances the emission reduction component of the oil and gas production, you can have opportunities. If you reduce flaring, but you reduce flaring in a way that allows you to capture that gas is additional volume. So methane emissions can be, obviously, they have to be coherent with a series of constraints that are set by policy, but policy can turn them into an opportunity with the help of the financial sector. And this will be very relevant for countries where the deployment of technology is essential for the legacy energies to have a future into a low carbon world and into a net zero type of approach.
Terrific. We have at least two topics on the table here. We've got water and we've got finance. And on finance, I think it's an interesting question. Some of the countries in this region have extraordinary financial capabilities, and I wonder, do they need external financing in order to finance their energy transition? Others have much less. And Robin and Olivia, want to comment on either the finance or the water topic?
I think on the finance topic, I'll just pick that up, and specifically in relation to, let's say, the wealthier countries, the GCC countries. They make a lot of use of external finance for their energy projects, both renewable and energy transition type projects and traditional projects, on a commercial basis, of course. and they can also self-fund those if necessary. But they're also very active international investors. And we've seen, particularly in the renewable space, and we see that, I mentioned this before with Masdar, Aqua Power, which is a Saudi private company but part owned by the Public Investment Fund, also a very active international investor in renewables, and absolutely brings in external finance for those projects, and therefore faces the challenges of financing projects in African jurisdictions in particular. So there is kind of the need for finance for their international activities. The other side that I would point to, and I'm sure Olivia will want to touch on this as well, is the issue of financing projects, and let's specifically think about CCS projects here. The challenge of financing projects which don't have an obvious commercial rationale. There isn't a 45Q tax credit here in the GC. There isn't a European carbon trading scheme. So there are many good carbon capture concepts, conceptual projects here. But if you are an industrial emitter and you've got a good CCS plan, how do you finance that? When there's no revenue stream from it. And this could apply to energy efficiency and many other kind of projects as well. But I think CCS is a particularly good example. Huge opportunity, no finance, no narrow-minded kind of business case. How do you create some kind of incentives and ways to take projects like that forward?
Any thoughts, Olivia? Lisa?
Yeah, I think what we've seen is a lot of important initiatives and coalitions coming out. So the Net Zero Producers Forum is one of those. The Methane Pledge is one of those. The First Movers Coalition. So I think what's needed now is, now that we have these coalitions and we have these commitments and this will, is now we need to come together and think through frameworks and agree globally what these mean. So for the region, is this working? For the region, if they're saying that they can create products using carbon capture and storage, they need a customer that's willing to buy that product. That needs to receive that same premium as made with by the green and renewable projects. A lot of the region's export partners as well are not just in wealthy nations, and there's energy demand that's expected to grow. If we bring developing countries up to OECD standard, we're going to see continued energy growth. Where is that energy going to come from? How can we make sure that that's clean energy? And are the development banks willing to support with the premium that it's going to cost to create that energy in a way that's kinder to the climate? So I think in order to see this, the region has been very clear and put forward what its energy transition will look like, what some of those technologies are. But now we need to have international agreement that these are the frameworks so that we can start to crowd in more financing and unlock more projects. Secretary Kerry said this morning in his remarks, 4 trillion of investment is needed to see this. So now that we have these coalitions, we need to start thinking through the frameworks that can start to unlock some more of that investment.
So far we've touched very lightly on 3 important technologies, and I just want to throw them out and then talk about them, see if anyone has thoughts. First, solar, obviously very important in this region. And what I often hear and read is extraordinary solar resource, but huge problem with dust in the region and sandstorms. And so I wonder any comments on the extent to which solar has potential in the barrier that sand and dust create. Second is wind, kind of how good are the wind resources in this region? And then third, energy efficiency. We have some countries in this region that don't price energy or barely price energy, and that has an impact on energy efficiency. So does anybody want to pick up any of those topics? Just throw it open.
I'll maybe quickly pick the solar one, David, because this is an issue that comes up.
Okay.
And we may have solar experts in the audience, which I apologise if I misrepresent this. What I understand from speaking to the solar developers here is, dry dust, not a problem. It settles on the panels. You clean it off every now and again. You get, of course, a slight degradation in performance, but it's not really. It's a maintenance issue. Wet dust is a problem. Wet dust sticks, hard to clean off. So these solar plants, whenever it looks like it's going to rain, doesn't rain here very often, but it does rain sometimes. When it looks like it's going to rain, get ready with the buckets, and when the rain is over, get out and clean off all the wet dust as quickly as possible before it gets stuck. So it's a maintenance issue. It's an operational cost. It's not a It's not a fundamental barrier.
Okay.
But I do think the very interesting thing about solar power here is, think about Northwest Europe, right? It's cold in winter, you need energy, but the sun is, there's not much sun. So your solar resource is not very well matched to your demand pattern. Completely different in MENA. 60% of in the Gulf, 60% of electricity is used for cooling. That's primarily, of course, in the summer when you have the sun. And so if you have batteries that will take you through a nighttime period, 12 hours overnight, not a particularly onerous task, and batteries have improved a lot, costs come down. You can have a system that will get to very high levels of solar penetration and meet most of your demand quite easily. So that kind of issue of long duration storage, which is such a problem for Europe for renewables, is much less of an issue here. And that's why I'm particularly positive that this region can get to pretty high levels of solar use, with maybe some nuclear as in the UAE, maybe some gas with CCS, but you could get to a zero carbon electricity system fairly easily, and a more robust system than you would see in Northern Europe or in parts of North America.
Any thoughts on either on wind or energy efficiency or
Let me
solar?
speak rapidly on energy efficiency, because I think that really correlates with policies and how we develop a system that allows demand to shift. A lot of debate on energy efficiency in the region has been translated, I think, instrumentally on general banalities on subsidies. I'm not downplaying the problem, but it is one of the major political issues for many countries of the region to enter the new world in which energy is a more innovatively priced product, and where you do not disrupt the living conditions of entire chunks of the population, especially those who are in a more difficult position to adapt their budgets and their daily patterns of life. And some countries have achieved an underrepresented result here. But clearly that is a region, that is an area of the energy system where I think we have to build robust policies. We have to build robust, let's say we have to build convergence and best practice convergence on how you achieve energy efficiency by transferring available technologies, by equating monitoring standards, by how you align the way that systems work. In Europe, I have to say, Europe has done a tremendous job on the energy efficiency bit, and has done a tremendous job on establishing an architecture for emissions being a part of the way that society quantifies its consumption, especially for industrial uses. So now we do have those building blocks, and I think the region can build its own patterns and its own policies, but definitely energy efficiency should be, for IFIs and DFIs, one of the key aspects to help countries designing solid, robust, and long-term policies.
Linking back the energy efficiency to the pricing and to the policies, I think they all have to be seen together. It's critical to look at that. The costs of harmful subsidies are tremendous globally around the world, and the spillover effect through the supply chain. When you have free energy, like you say, then you have overpumping of water, you have fertilizers that are subsidized, then you have the overuse, and then water pollution. So they're all part of a whole cycle. But let me tease back. I like, you really did frame that MENA region is a very diverse region, right? And you have some countries that have huge needs. So from the World Bank, some of them are client countries. We actually have we support them financially. There are many countries in the region, the Gulf states. We're really just knowledge partners, right? So at the bank, we have three functions. One is the financing, it's the knowledge, and the partnerships. So we have a very interesting, different relationship across the region and how we can make the knowledge and the funding flow. In terms of climate finance, so the MENA region today receives the smallest amount of climate finance. It only receives an estimated about 16 billion per year. That's according to CPI. And if you add up everybody's NDCs, their national determined contributions, the financing needs are estimated to be 186 billion. And that's just the NDCs. That doesn't include, like Olivia mentioned, it's not just NDCs, but new commitments that countries have made, be it the Methane Pledge, the Green Grids Initiative, all these new initiatives that countries are signing up to. So we think it's really important for countries to crowd in the financing. You really need that long-term strategy. You need government's commitment. What is the trajectory that they want to follow? How are they going to get to the development needs with a low emissions trajectory and also address the issues of adaptation? So that is really important in the planning package, is to have a direction. And the country, the CCDRs I mentioned, the country climate development reports that we did in 20 countries. We released 20 of them at COP. 27, we're doing another 20. We did a first batch here in the MENA region. We did Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Morocco. And they're really important takeaways, because this is real analytics at the country. What will it take you to achieve your development targets and with climate considerations? And what we see is that, no surprise that addressing the energy transition, that adding renewables to the energy mix is optimal up to a certain point. But you also need other technological solutions for the transition to be cost effective. We see, of course, the importance of policies and regulations that to crowd in financing, that's how you're going to lower the cost of financing, by having, de-risking also at the policy and regulatory environment. And again, there's been so much conversation about that. What are the barriers to market failure, and understanding and drilling it down, and how do you de-risk? And so I think that's what the climate finance solution is to take the long-term strategies, look at impactful programs, and I think this morning it was mentioned several times, the JETPs, the Just Energy Transition platforms that they have for coal in South Africa and Indonesia. These are hugely expensive programs, but teasing out what's public sector, what's private sector, what's viable, what's not. In this region, it's like, what are you decarbonizing? And then what about the renewable energy? There's almost an assumption that renewable energy, the private sector will come in to invest in renewables. But the decommissioning of coal fire or decarbonization, that's where you say, is that just going to come in from the private sector? Is that where you have to put some concessional money in? And of course, where's the community? Where's the reskilling? All the other issues that are linked. So I think that's what's really important, where we can move to, is supporting countries to tease out their national strategies and then packages, big, huge programs and packages of investment, and then defining who invests what in what. And I think that's something that we really look forward to, and that brings in the public and private sector together.
Thank you. Well, we're almost out of time. One topic I want to touch on is COP28, and any opportunities anyone sees on COP28 quickly. And then once we're done that, maybe just quick final thoughts, starting with Jennifer and coming this way.
Yeah, COP28 is great, and wonderful to see UAE take it, really building up directly. 2 COPs in a row in the same region is fantastic, to build on Egypt or what came out of Egypt. Let's not forget, this is the year of the stock take. And I think if countries take stock seriously, we do a serious stock take, we really do need to know where we are standing for forward planning. And of course, we're going to have to be addressing this loss and damage. And those 2 dimensions, as we run up to it, is an important opportunity, that we look at the mitigation agenda and we look at the adaptation, and they come hand in hand. I really like the idea that they're calling this an inclusive COP. So.
Terrific. Why don't we just go Marco, Olivia, and Robin for any final thoughts?
Well, building on what Jennifer just said, the inclusiveness dimension is, I think, essential. And it started, let me flag one particular aspect of the post-COP26 environment. This idea that there is a non-state actors component when we build platforms, when we bring industry alliances on board, when we bring the private sector to really put on the table what the private sector can do and identify means by which the policy environment can directly help across the board all of these solutions come on stream. So this is a component that I think can be even better amplified here. Well, it will be in Dubai, but in the UAE and from Abu Dhabi, let's say, with a degree of experience and with an extraordinary history of developing this country into an innovation hub. The second dimension in the inclusiveness that I think is interesting is how to have, again, those regions of the world that have been so far either skeptical or defensive or felt I will not go into the global south, global north development, but we need all regions of the world to bring their demand for change to the table. And there I see, for example, implementation of Article 6, and I see the role of international financing institutions and the umbrella agreements that we need to find to understand what forestry can look like, what offset opportunities can look like, and all those levers that can really bring to the table different set of needs and different set of actors. And very last, I come from the energy sector. We've seen it throughout the 2 days we've been living together. I believe this is the COP in which the shock that we had because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the supply security crisis that we've been living through will deliver a positive outcome if we are together in the same room, everyone, and if we call everyone to be a part of the solutions, if we recognize that the oil and gas industry has competences, has market presence, has capital, has ideas, and has commitments in a large chunk of its constituency. If we recognize that the youth have done a terrific job in putting the need for climate policy at the center of the political agenda, but now we have to go into a measure of pragmatism altogether, designing solutions that go across all energy vectors, and if we move beyond ideology.
Olivia, Robin, I'm told Kadri Simpson is about to go on stage in the main room there. So, but we want to hear from you in closing thoughts. But any quick closing thoughts to leave us with?
Yeah, closing thoughts, just echoing what's already been said. The inclusivity really just brings a very unique opportunity for us to now come forward with a roadmap and with practical application, with financing, with more projects. And I think having that level setter of all actors at the table, scientists, technology, industry, finances, all actors across all sectors and all regions, it really presents an incredibly unique opportunity to start seeing some action.
Robin, you have the last word.
Yes, thank you. Well, Kadri Simpson's got European problems to think about, I think, but I think one thing to bear in mind in this region, its problems are, and its challenges are very different from those in Europe, and we've touched on some of those. But, climate change is an existential threat to countries in this region, as elsewhere in the world, for climatic reasons, but also for economic reasons, because of the need to replace the export of hydrocarbons and these unabated hydrocarbons with something else. And other countries in this region are very well aware of that. It's not an easy challenge. No.
Well, big thanks to the Atlantic Council for organizing this. Big thanks to our panelists. Please give them a big hand.
Thank you, David.
Thanks very much.